The summer of 1990 in central Kentucky was the kind that seemed endless. Long, golden evenings fading into firefly nights, small towns breathing slow, and country roads stretching under skies that smelled faintly of rain and honeysuckle. But for a quiet community just outside Elizabethtown, that peace shattered one August night, when a young woman vanished without a trace, and with her, a piece of the town's innocence disappeared too. Her name was Hannah Reeves, a 26-year-old elementary school teacher known for her gentle voice and the calm way she handled her students, even the rowdiest ones. She taught second grade at Meadowfield Elementary, where every parent trusted her with their kids. People described her as steady, kind, and the sort who believed the world could be fixed with patience. Hannah had grown up nearby, the eldest of three sisters, and had recently moved into a small white house she'd bought on her own after saving for years. It was a big step, her first house, her own place, a life she was building piece by piece. On the evening of August 12, 1990, Hannah left a small Sunday gathering at her friend's farmhouse just before 9 p.m. She had laughed with her friends, eaten peach pie, and talked about how she was excited for the new school year starting in a week. She told them she had lesson plans to finish and an early start the next day. Then she hugged them goodbye, walked to her navy blue Toyota, and drove off into the warm Kentucky night. She never made it home. The next morning, when she didn't show up to school or answer her phone, her colleagues assumed she might have overslept or fallen ill. By noon, her principal called her sister, Claire Reeves, who said she hadn't heard from Hannah either, which was unlike her. By 2 p.m., Claire drove to Hannah's house herself. The front door was locked. The car was gone. Inside, everything looked untouched. The bed neatly made, a cup on the counter, the light in the kitchen still on. On the table sat Hannah's school planner, open to Monday's page, neat handwriting listing lesson ideas for reading and spelling. By that evening, when the police were called, the small-town calm had turned into something heavy, a feeling people described later as the air being different. Officers began by checking the road she would have taken home from her friend's farmhouse and about a 12-minute drive through back roads and tree-lined curves. Near the intersection of Highway 62 and a gravel road called Peachtree Lane, a deputy spotted a faint glint of metal in the ditch. It was Hannah's car, half hidden by weeds, the driver's door closed but unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. There were no signs of a crash, no tire marks, no broken glass. The car seemed carefully parked off the road, not wrecked. Inside, her purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet untouched, a cassette tape halfway through a song. But Hannah was gone. For a place like Elizabethtown, this kind of mystery wasn't common. The 1990s had just begun, but life still felt closer to the 70s in many ways. Doors left unlocked, neighbors greeting each other by name, news spreading by word of mouth. The disappearance hit the town like a storm nobody saw coming. Over the next few days, local policemen, led by Detective Mark Dillard, a seasoned investigator who had grown up in the same county, began organizing search parties. Volunteers from the community combed through woods and fields. Flyers with Hannah's photo went up in grocery stores, diners, and on bulletin boards at gas stations. Her family held on to hope, refusing to believe she wouldn't be found alive. She'd never just run off, her father told reporters. Not Hannah. She's too responsible for that. Yet as the days passed, hope started turning into dread. There were no ransom calls, no suspicious withdrawals from her bank account, and no witnesses who had seen anything unusual on the road that night. One farmer mentioned hearing a car engine late that evening near Peachtree Lane, revving then cutting out, but couldn't recall much else. A week later, police brought in state troopers and tracking dogs. They scoured the woods behind where the car had been found, but the heat and humidity made conditions difficult. Nothing surfaced. The leads thinned. People began locking their doors for the first time in years. Detective Dillard grew obsessed with the case. He interviewed Hannah's co-workers, students' parents, neighbors, anyone who might have noticed something odd in the days before she vanished. That's when one small detail emerged. A man in a dark pickup truck had been seen parked near the school several times that summer, watching the playground. He hadn't caused trouble, but his presence had made one teacher uneasy. She described him as mid-30s light hair, quiet, the type who avoids eye contact. But nobody knew who he was. Police circulated a sketch based on her description, but with no license plate, no clear identification, it led nowhere. Dillard followed dozens of tips. A drifter seen at a gas station, a stranger asking about directions, but each one fizzled. Weeks turned into months, and by winter the trail had gone cold. In the years that followed, Hannah's case haunted the community. Her parents moved away in 1992, unable to drive past the empty white house she had loved. The property sold to another family, but the locals still called it the Reeves place. The mystery became one of those quiet tragedies small towns carry, unspoken, but never forgotten. Every so often, a new detective would take a look at the old files, hoping fresh eyes might catch something, but the evidence in a car, a few photographs, some fibers, no body, didn't leave much to work with. DNA technology was in its infancy, and small departments didn't have the resources to process trace evidence like big city labs did. Still, Detective Dillard never stopped thinking about it. Even after he retired in 2004, he kept a file box labeled Reeves H on his shelf at home. He used to say, "You can't close a case like that." Not truly. Time marched on. The roads changed. The fields turned into housing lots, and people who had known Hannah grew older, moved away, or passed on. By the late 2000s, most folks under 30 barely remembered her story. Until one day, more than 20 years later, a county surveyor working near the old creek bed a mile from Peachtree Lane noticed something strange in the soil. He was clearing brush when his metal rod struck something solid, something that gave a hollow sound. When he looked closer, he realized it wasn't a rock. It was the corner of a rusted metal object half buried. At first he thought it was an old oil drum. Then he saw what looked like a piece of fabric protruding from the dirt, faded, almost unrecognizable. He called the sheriff's office. Within hours, the area was sealed off. Investigators dug carefully through the soil, unearthing what appeared to be a shallow grave, and inside it, partial remains, wrapped in cloth and plastic. It was clear the remains had been there for decades. The sheriff's office contacted the state forensic lab in Frankfurt, which took custody of the remains for testing. For those who had lived through the 1990 disappearance, the discovery reopened old wounds. The local paper ran the headline, "Unidentified remains found near site of 1990 disappearance." Everyone knew whose name came to mind first. Detective Dillard, now in his late 60s, came out of retirement to assist. "If this is Hannah," he told the press, "then maybe her family will finally have the truth they've waited for." It took months, but forensic experts managed to extract DNA from the bones. In 2012, with advances in technology that hadn't existed 2 decades earlier, they ran the sample against a family reference profile Claire Reeves had submitted years before. The results were conclusive. The remains belonged to Hannah Reeves. Her family held a small memorial that spring, the closure they'd long prayed for, though the word closure felt too small for the ache of it all. Still, they buried her beside their parents, under a tree that bloomed white in April. Yet for Detective Dillard and for many who had followed the case, the bigger question remained: who had taken her life and why? The answer, as it would turn out, had been sitting quietly in the background all along, buried not just in dirt, but in the forgotten corners of the investigation itself. When Hannah Reeves was finally laid to rest in 2012, the town of Elizabethtown felt a sense of collective stillness, a quiet recognition that a chapter, long left unfinished, had at last been acknowledged. But acknowledgement wasn't justice. Her killer was still out there somewhere, and nobody wanted to believe that someone capable of such a thing had lived among them all those years. After the DNA confirmation, the Kentucky State Police reopened the case file in its entirety. A new generation of detectives armed with technology far beyond what existed in 1990 began combing through evidence that had once seemed too degraded or insignificant. They called it Project Echo, a code name referencing how the past can echo through time if you know where to listen. Detective Sarah Langford, then 38, was assigned as the lead investigator. She had grown up just 2 towns away and remembered hearing Hannah's name as a girl. It was like a ghost story parents told, she later said. Everyone knew the story, but no one ever talked about who might have done it. Langford was known in the department for her patience and her calm intensity, the kind of investigator who didn't get distracted by noise. When she opened the Reeves file, she felt something stir inside her. It was thick, packed with old photos, handwritten reports, and Polaroids that had long faded to a pale green hue. The first thing she noticed was how little physical evidence had ever been processed. Back in 1990, Kentucky didn't have the same laboratory infrastructure for trace evidence as it did now. Fibers, soil samples, and even fingernail scrapings had been stored but never tested. Now those samples could tell entire stories. Langford ordered a full re-examination of every item. The forensics team began carefully cataloging and digitizing the evidence, sealing and logging each piece under updated protocols. One bag caught their attention. A swab taken from inside Hannah's car door handle. It had been stored since the day her vehicle was found, untouched for over 2 decades. By 2013, with advanced DNA testing, that sample yielded a partial male profile, too degraded for a full identification, but strong enough to be compared through CODIS, the national DNA database. Weeks later, Langford received the first result. No match. She wasn't surprised. Whoever had done this was either never arrested for a violent crime or had lived quietly, leaving no trace of his name in national systems. But something about the old witness sketch from 1990, the man in the dark pickup seen watching the school, stuck in her mind. She pinned that sketch on the wall above her desk. "We find him," she told her team, "and we find what happened." Meanwhile, she started re-interviewing anyone still alive who had known Hannah. Her sister Claire, now in her early 50s, met her at a diner off the main highway. She still carried the softness of her younger years, but her eyes had the guarded look of someone who'd spent too many nights thinking about unanswered questions. She was nervous that summer, Claire told her. Not scared exactly, just cautious. She mentioned a man once, said he kept showing up near the schoolyard. She thought maybe he worked maintenance nearby, but she never found out. Langford nodded, taking notes. Did she ever say if she knew him? No, just that he made her uneasy. From there, Langford worked outward. She located one of Hannah's old co-workers, Diane Mercer, who now lived in Tennessee. Diane remembered that in July 1990, just a few weeks before Hannah vanished, a man had come to the school office asking if they needed groundskeeping help. He had this strange politeness, she recalled. Smiled a lot, but it never reached his eyes. When she told him the district handled hiring elsewhere, he thanked her and left. His name, she said, was Ray. She couldn't remember a last name. Langford began pulling public employment and background records for anyone named Ray who had worked in or around Hardin County in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Dozens of results appeared, but one name stood out. Raymond Holt, a former maintenance contractor who had done occasional electrical work at the Meadowfield School District from 1988 to 1990. He had no criminal record, but left the area abruptly that fall. The same season Hannah disappeared. When Langford requested his employment file, she noticed something peculiar. The termination paperwork was dated August 14, 1990, 2 days after Hannah went missing. The reason listed was failure to return equipment. It was the first real lead in decades. Langford drove to Bardstown, about an hour from Elizabethtown, where Holt had reportedly lived before leaving the area. She found the old address listed under his name, a small single-story home that had since been sold 3 times. The current owner said he remembered hearing that the man who lived there before was quiet, kept to himself, liked fishing. Langford checked DMV records and discovered that a Raymond Holt, born 1957, still had an active license, now living in Bowling Green, Kentucky. He was 71 years old. When she pulled his record photo, her pulse quickened. The gray hair and wrinkles couldn't mask the resemblance to the 1990 sketch. Same square jaw, same light-colored eyes. Langford and her partner, Detective Eddie Ruiz, decided to approach him carefully. They drove to Bowling Green one Friday morning in May 2014, parking down the street from a modest house with a faded blue mailbox. Holt came outside mid-morning to water his plants. He looked frail but alert. Langford introduced herself politely, flashing her badge. "Mr. Holt, I'm Detective Langford with the Kentucky State Police. We're following up on an old case from the 1990s involving a woman named Hannah Reeves. You may remember her." Holt blinked, his expression stiffening for just a fraction of a second before he smiled faintly. "Can't say I do," he said. "I've met a lot of people in my life." Langford kept her tone even. "You used to do some work for the Meadowfield School District around that time." "Yeah, I might have. Been a long while. Would you mind coming down to the station to answer a few questions? It's part of a routine follow-up." He hesitated, glancing at Ruiz, then back at her. "Do I have to?" "No, sir," Langford said gently. "You don't have to. But we'd appreciate your help." After a pause, Holt nodded. "All right. Let me get my jacket." At the Bowling Green substation, Holt sat across from Langford in a quiet interview room. The tape recorder clicked on. She started simple, asking about his time working maintenance, the kinds of schools he visited, if he remembered anyone by name. Holt gave short, careful answers. He said he had been hired through a contractor, not the school directly, and claimed he left the job after a mix-up with tools. Then Langford shifted topics. "Do you remember ever meeting a teacher named Hannah Reeves?" He looked down at his hands. "No, ma'am. Don't think I do." She slid a photograph across the table. Hannah's staff portrait from 1989, laminated from an old file. She taught second grade. He glanced at it briefly, then shrugged. "Doesn't ring a bell." Langford nodded, letting silence fill the room. "It's a detective's oldest trick. Let the quiet do the talking." Holt shifted in his chair. After several seconds, she leaned forward. "Mr. Holt, when we found her car back in 1990, we collected some items for evidence. With today's technology, we can test for DNA. We found a sample that belongs to a man. Would you be willing to give a cheek swab just to eliminate yourself?" For the first time, Holt's composure faltered. "You think I had something to do with that girl? I think it's been a long time and we want to be thorough." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't think I need to do that." Langford smiled faintly. "That's your right. But refusing could lead us to get a warrant, and that'll bring more questions than answers." After a long moment, Holt sighed and nodded. "Fine. Whatever helps you people move on." The swab was taken quietly. Holt left soon after, muttering that he hoped they found their answers. Langford watched him go, her instincts screaming. Something about the way he avoided eye contact, the way his tone shifted whenever Hannah's name came up. It was all too controlled, too careful. She'd seen it before in men who thought time had buried their sins. 2 weeks later, the lab results came back. Partial DNA from Hannah's car handle, degraded but readable, matched Raymond Holt's genetic profile at 12 points out of 15. Not enough for a definitive prosecution, but enough to warrant a deeper look. Langford obtained a search warrant for Holt's property. The house in Bowling Green was modest but cluttered, filled with old tools, fishing rods, and boxes labeled with years. In one of those boxes, buried beneath newspapers, detectives found something that froze everyone in place, a small, silver pendant shaped like a leaf, tarnished, but still delicate. Claire Reeves later confirmed it belonged to Hannah. It had been a birthday gift she'd given her sister in 1988. Forensic teams swept the house collecting fibers, soil samples, and clothing for analysis. In the garage they found a 1984 Chevy pickup, dark green, matching the description from the 1990 reports. Langford stood beside it, staring quietly. "He's been living with this ghost his whole life," she murmured. The evidence was mounting, but she knew it wasn't enough. The DNA link was partial. The pendant could be dismissed as found or coincidental. To secure an arrest, she needed a confession, or something close. She decided to visit him again. When she returned to Holt's house a few days later, he didn't answer the door. She saw movement inside, curtains shifting but no sound. She left her card wedged in the doorframe. 2 days later he called. "I've been thinking," his voice rasped through the phone. "You said you found a something. Maybe I can help clear a few things up." They agreed to meet at the station again. This time, Holt looked different, drawn, pale, as if the years had finally caught up to him. He asked for a cup of water, and as Langford turned the recorder on, he stared at his hands for a long while. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," he began quietly. "Back then, things got out of hand." Langford said nothing. "She was kind," he continued. "Too kind. I just wanted to talk to her. I used to see her outside after school. Thought maybe she'd remember me from fixing the lights once. She didn't. She got scared. Started yelling." He took a shaky breath. "I panicked." Langford's pen didn't move. She just watched him. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said again. But once it started, it went too far. When she asked what he did next, he whispered, "I put her in the truck. Drove out near the creek. I didn't think anyone would find her there." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Langford exhaled slowly, knowing she was hearing the end of something that had begun before she even became a detective. Holt looked up at her finally. "I didn't mean for it to go that way," he said again. "You gotta believe that." Langford closed her notebook. "What I believe," she said evenly, "is that you've been carrying this for 30 years. That night, Raymond Holt was formally arrested and charged with the murder of Hannah Reeves. 24 years after her disappearance, outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, their microphones catching words like breakthrough, justice, and closure. But for Claire Reeves, standing quietly at the back, it wasn't about any of those things. She told one reporter softly, "It's not justice we waited for, and it's truth. And now at least we have that." When the news of Raymond Holt's arrest broke in the summer of 2014, the story spread far beyond the small towns of central Kentucky. Television crews from Louisville and Lexington camped outside the Hardin County Courthouse, cameras flashing as officers led the 71-year-old man in handcuffs up the steps. It had been 24 years since Hannah Reeves vanished, and most people had stopped expecting justice. But now, as headlines read, "Arrest made in 1990 Elizabethtown cold case," old wounds reopened, along with a collective breath of relief. Detective Sarah Langford, who had spent 2 years reconstructing the fragments of the past, watched the arrest quietly from across the street. He was old now, she later said, but the age didn't erase what he'd done. Some people mistake time for redemption. It's not the same thing. The trial, because of Holt's age and the time elapsed, prosecutors faced a difficult road. The original forensic evidence was limited, and though Holt had given a partial confession, his defense claimed his memory was unreliable, that he had been pressured, confused, and misunderstood. He recanted most of what he said just days after the interview. Still, the prosecution believed they had enough to move forward. They built their case on 3 pillars: the recovered pendant, the DNA match on the car handle, and Holt's own words on tape. In late 2015, the trial began at the Hardin County Circuit Court. The courtroom filled each day with reporters, locals, and former students of Hannah Reeves who were now adults with families of their own. Her sister Claire sat quietly behind the prosecution table, a small silver bracelet around her wrist, the same one Hannah had given her when they were young. The state's attorney, Megan Porter, began her opening statement simply. This case is not about time. It is about truth. It is about a young woman whose life was taken and a community that never forgot her. She painted a picture of Hannah's final hours, driving home after a Sunday gathering, intercepted by a man who had been watching her for weeks. Porter reminded the jury that Holt had worked near the school, that he left town days after her disappearance, and that her pendant had been found in his home 24 years later. You'll hear the defendant say he didn't mean for it to happen, she said. But intent is measured not by words spoken decades later. It's measured by the choices made that night. Holt's defense attorney, Carl Dixon, countered that the evidence was circumstantial and deteriorated by time. He told the jury that Holt was a lonely, confused old man, manipulated by police into confessing. You cannot convict a man on partial memories and faded evidence, Dixon argued. Justice delayed should not become justice distorted. Witnesses, the prosecution called Claire Reeves first. Her voice was calm but heavy as she described the morning Hannah failed to show up for school, the days of searching, the years of silence. When shown the pendant recovered from Holt's garage, her eyes filled with tears. That was hers, she said softly. I gave it to her. She never took it off. Next came Detective Langford. She detailed how the investigation had been revived, explaining the DNA testing process and how Holt's profile matched the sample from Hannah's car. When asked how certain she was that Holt was responsible, Langford looked toward him and replied, As certain as science in his own words can make me. The recording of Holt's confession played in court, his voice faint and shaking, describing how he just wanted to talk and how things got out of hand. The room fell completely silent. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably as he spoke of driving toward the creek. Then, when the tape ended, Porter turned to the jury. You just heard him tell you where he left her, and 24 years later we found her right where he said. The defense brought in a neuropsychologist who testified that Holt's memory could have been compromised by age and medication. They claimed he was easily influenced, that his statements were the confused ramblings of an elderly man trying to please investigators. Holt himself took the stand briefly, his voice fragile. I didn't do what they're saying, he muttered. I don't remember that girl. They put words in my mouth. But during cross-examination, when Porter showed him the old photograph of Hannah, he hesitated, just for a second, and something flickered across his face. The moment was small, but it landed heavy in the room. The verdict after 10 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. Claire Reeves gripped her bracelet tightly as the clerk read the verdict. Guilty of murder in the second degree. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Holt stared forward blankly as the judge thanked the jury for their service. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he shook his head. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, a sentence he would almost certainly not live to see through. Outside, rain began to fall, the first in weeks. It ran down the courthouse steps as reporters called out questions, but Claire didn't speak. She simply said, "It's over now," and walked to her car. Aftermath. For the residents of Elizabethtown, the verdict closed one of the darkest chapters in local memory. The story had haunted the town for nearly a quarter century. People who had once been children in Hannah's classroom brought flowers to her old school, where a small memorial garden was planted in her honor. The plaque read, "In memory of Miss Hannah Reeves, a teacher, a sister, a light, Detective Langford, who had since transferred to the state's cold case division, said the Reeves investigation changed how she approached every case after that. Sometimes, she said in an interview, it's not about finding what's new, It's about listening to what's been waiting to be heard all along. Holt's health declined quickly in prison. He suffered a stroke in 2019 and was transferred to a medical correctional facility. He passed away 2 years later, never having filed an appeal. The Department of Corrections notified the Reeves family quietly without ceremony. Claire's only comment was that she hoped he had finally found the truth he ran from. The legacy by the time the case closed. More than 3 decades had passed since Hannah's disappearance. The technology that solved her case, forensic DNA profiling, digital evidence databases, geospatial mapping, hadn't even existed when she was alive. But the heart of the investigation, people said, wasn't science. It was persistence. Human determination refusing to let her story be forgotten. In 2021, the Kentucky State Police launched an initiative named the Reeves Project, aimed at revisiting unsolved disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s across rural counties. Detective Langford was one of its first coordinators. She often told new recruits about Hannah's case, how a tiny piece of evidence left untouched for decades had carried the weight of a family's unanswered prayers. She reminds us, Langford said during a community event, that justice doesn't have an expiration date. Every year since 2015, Meadowfield Elementary holds a small candlelight service in late August. Former students gather in the school courtyard, now framed by a mural of wildflowers painted by local children. One by one they light candles and place them near the memorial plaque, whispering thanks to the teacher who once taught them how to spell, read, and be kind. Some of them still remember her voice, calm, gentle, guiding them through lessons that felt small at the time but stayed with them for life. And though decades have passed, when people in Elizabethtown speak of Hannah Reeves, they don't talk about her death. They talk about her patience, her laughter, the way she made a classroom feel like a second home. The years that took her couldn't take that. One evening, long after the trial and the press had faded, Claire drove out to the place near the creek where Hannah's remains had been found. The woods were quiet again, green and overgrown, the way they might have been before that night in 1990. She knelt beside the water, holding a small bouquet of lilies. "I kept my promise," she whispered. "You're home now." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment she swore she could hear her sister's laughter again. Soft, carried on the air, the sound of peace long delayed but finally delivered.